The city bus trundled through the bustling streets, weaving through the urban maze of cars, pedestrians, and towering skyscrapers. Inside, passengers sat in their usual morning stupor, some scrolling through their phones, others reading newspapers or staring blankly out the window. It was a routine commute, a seamless part of the city's everyday hum. Among the passengers, a small boy named Carter sat alone, his small body barely filling the seat marked with the familiar blue icon of priority seating. Carter was around 8 years old, dressed in a faded red hoodie and jeans. His backpack, adorned with a sticker of a smiling cartoon whale, sat on his lap. He appeared calm, gazing out of the window at the blur of buildings and people, his legs too short to reach the floor, leaving them to dangle above the edge of the seat. But beneath his calm exterior was a storm of thoughts and feelings that no one on the bus could see. As the bus pulled up to the next stop, the passengers seemed to come alive. A shuffle of movement began as new people boarded and a few disembarked. Among the new arrivals was an elderly man, stooped with age, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. His face was etched with deep wrinkles, and his once bright eyes had dimmed with the weight of years. His movements were slow, deliberate, every step a calculated effort. The man, whose name was Eric, shuffled down the aisle, his eyes scanning for a seat. It was clear to everyone on the bus that he needed to sit. His hands shook slightly as he gripped the cane, his legs unsteady as the bus swayed gently. The seats were mostly filled now, but Eric's gaze landed on the priority seat where Carter sat. With a polite smile, Eric approached the young boy, assuming the child would do what was expected. "Excuse me, young man," he began, his voice kind yet tired. "Would you mind giving me that seat? I need to sit." Carter's gaze shifted slowly from the window to Eric. His small hands gripped the edge of his seat tighter. He didn't answer immediately, as if weighing the situation in his mind. The seconds ticked by, and the quiet murmur of conversation on the bus faded as nearby passengers started to take notice. The expectation hung in the air, thick with silent judgment. Finally, Carter shook his head, his expression firm. "No," he said simply. A collective intake of breath filled the bus. The word rang out like a bell, cutting through the stillness, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. No one could quite believe what they had just heard. Eric blinked, confused. His hearing wasn't what it used to be. Perhaps he hadn't understood the boy correctly. "I'm sorry," he said with a gentle chuckle, trying to make light of the moment. "I must not have heard you right. Could you repeat that?" But Carter didn't change his stance. He looked Eric in the eye, a slight tremble betraying his nerves, but his resolve remained intact. "I said no," he repeated, this time more clearly. The elderly man stood there, taken aback. His eyes widened slightly, the humor in them fading. Around them, passengers exchanged bewildered glances. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd, people craning their necks to get a better look at the young boy who had just refused to give up a seat that, by all accounts, wasn't his to keep. A middle-aged woman seated nearby spoke up, her tone sharp with disapproval. "Hey kid, get off that seat. Can't you see the man needs it?" Carter shook his head again, more resolutely this time. I can't leave the seat," he said, his voice soft but firm, as if he was speaking more to himself than to anyone else. The murmur of voices grew louder, a cacophony of confusion and judgment. "What's wrong with him?" someone muttered. "Where are his parents?" another voice chimed in. A younger man standing near the back shook his head in disbelief. "Kids these days. No respect." But Carter didn't move. His small hands clenched tightly around the straps of his backpack, his eyes fixed straight ahead, avoiding the glares and the whispers. He couldn't leave the seat. He just couldn't. The bus jerked slightly as it resumed its route, and Eric, still standing, swayed on his feet, his grip tightening on the cane. For a moment he looked like he might fall. Instinctively, a kind man standing behind Eric reached out, steadying him before he could topple over. "Easy there," the man said, his voice warm with concern as he helped Eric regain his balance. "Thank you, son," Eric murmured, a faint tremor in his voice. His gaze flickered back to Carter, the confusion still evident on his face. He didn't understand. No one did. Why wouldn't the boy move? "Eric, now leaning heavily on his cane, tried one more time. "Son," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading, "I really need to sit, please." But Carter didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed fixed on the scenery outside the window, his jaw set with a stubbornness that seemed unnatural for a child his age. "I'm sorry," Carter whispered, barely audible over the hum of the bus. "I can't move." By now the tension on the bus had reached its peak. Everyone was watching, waiting for something to happen, for someone to intervene. The elderly man looked tired, defeated even, while Carter seemed locked in an invisible struggle, refusing to yield. Finally, the bus driver glanced into his rearview mirror, noticing the commotion. With a furrowed brow, he pulled the bus to a stop at the next intersection. The vehicle's sudden stillness seemed to mirror the mounting tension inside. "Is there a problem back there?" the driver called out, his voice echoing through the now silent bus. Passengers exchanged uncertain glances, none of them knowing quite how to answer. But the woman from earlier stood up, her face flushed with indignation. "Yes, there is," she shouted back. "This boy won't give up his seat for an elderly man? It's ridiculous." The driver sighed, muttering something under his breath before unbuckling his seatbelt and rising from his seat. As he made his way down the aisle, the eyes of every passenger followed him, hopeful that he could resolve the standoff. He stopped in front of Carter, his expression stern but not unkind. "Son," he began, crouching slightly to meet the boy's eye level. "Why won't you give the man your seat?" Carter stared at the driver for a long moment, the flicker of fear flashing across his face before it was replaced by that same steely resolve. His voice, though quiet, was steady. "My mom told me not to move. I have to stay here." The driver's stern expression faltered for a moment. He blinked, clearly caught off guard by Carter's answer. "Your mom told you not to move," he repeated, his voice softening just slightly. He looked around, half expecting to see the boy's mother somewhere nearby, but there was no one who appeared to be watching over Carter. "Yes," Carter confirmed, his small voice barely above a whisper. "She said it's important. I can't leave the seat." The bus driver exchanged glances with Eric, who looked as puzzled as anyone else. The rest of the passengers had fallen silent, straining to catch every word of the strange exchange. The entire bus seemed to be hanging on the boy's explanation, hoping for some understanding as to why he was so adamant about staying put. The driver sighed, running a hand over his thinning hair. He was clearly at a loss for how to proceed. He crouched further down, his voice now low and gentle, as if trying to coax a frightened animal. "Son, I'm sure your mom didn't mean for you to keep the seat if someone else needed it, especially someone like this gentleman here. It's the right thing to do." Carter shook his head again, more determined now. "No, I can't move." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotional weight behind his words. "She said it's important." There was something in Carter's eyes, something more than simple stubbornness or defiance. It was fear. Real fear. He wasn't just being difficult, he was genuinely afraid of what would happen if he left that seat. The driver noticed it too, and for a brief moment, the bus driver hesitated, as if sensing that this was no ordinary situation. Eric, still standing and leaning heavily on his cane, cleared his throat. "Maybe the boy's right," he said softly, his voice calm but weary. "Maybe we should just leave him be." The driver turned to look at the elderly man, surprised by his words. "Sir, you need the seat. The boy can find another spot. It's the rules." Eric waved his free hand dismissively. "I'm fine. I can stand a little longer," but the strain in his voice suggested otherwise. He was clearly exhausted, but his eyes had softened as he looked at Carter. "No, you shouldn't have to stand," the driver insisted, now feeling a mixture of frustration and helplessness. He looked at Carter again, trying to reason with him one last time. "Come on, son, let the man sit." But Carter's expression didn't change. "I can't," he said for the final time, his voice tinged with sadness. His grip on the seat tightened, and his knuckles turned white. He looked down at his lap, his small frame trembling slightly as the weight of the situation bore down on him. The passengers around them exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers floated through the bus, conversations too quiet for Carter to hear but loud enough to create an oppressive atmosphere. The boy seemed to shrink further into his seat, hunching over as if he could somehow make himself invisible. Then, as if on cue, the soft trill of a cell phone rang out from inside Carter's backpack. The sound was sudden and unexpected, cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. Carter's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock, and he immediately began fumbling with his backpack, trying to unzip it as quickly as his small hands would allow. The passengers watched curiously, and the driver straightened, taking a step back to give the boy space. Carter pulled out a small, old-fashioned flip phone from his backpack, a device that looked wildly out of place in the hands of a modern child. His fingers trembled as he opened it and brought it to his ear. "Hello," Carter's voice wavered, barely audible above the hum of the bus's engine. Whoever was on the other end of the line spoke quickly, the words too muffled for anyone else to hear. But whatever they were saying, it caused a visible change in Carter. His face paled, and his eyes darted around the bus nervously, as if searching for something or someone. He swallowed hard, nodding even though the person on the other end couldn't see him. "I'm here," Carter whispered into the phone, his voice filled with dread. "I didn't move." The person on the phone said something else, and Carter's hand tightened around the device, his knuckles turning even whiter. He closed his eyes, listening intently, his breathing becoming more rapid. I'm scared," Carter finally admitted, his voice barely above a breath. "But I stayed, just like you told me." The bus was eerily silent now, every passenger riveted to the strange conversation. No one knew what to make of it, but the atmosphere had shifted from frustration to something more akin to concern. The boy's fear was palpable, and it was becoming increasingly clear that something deeper was going on. After a few more moments of tense silence, Carter nodded again and quietly said, "Okay, I'll wait then." Without another word, he closed the phone and placed it back into his backpack, zipping it up carefully as if sealing away the conversation and everything it meant. The driver, still standing nearby, cleared his throat softly. "Everything okay, son?" Carter didn't answer right away. He took a deep breath, calming himself before finally looking up at the driver. His eyes were filled with unshed tears, but he blinked them away, trying to appear braver than he felt. "I can't move," Carter whispered, his voice barely holding together. "My mom told me. She said if I move from this seat, something bad will happen. She said I have to stay here until she gets back." The words sent a chill through the bus. The driver's brow furrowed in confusion. "Where is your mom, son?" Carter didn't answer. His lips trembled and he looked away, staring out the window once again, as if willing the outside world to take him far away from the questioning eyes around him. The driver and passengers exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the boy's words settling heavily in the air. Just then, the bus pulled into another stop. The doors hissed open, and a woman boarded, her eyes scanning the passengers as she hurried down the aisle. She looked frazzled, her face pale, her hands shaking. It was Carter's mother. She spotted her son immediately, rushing to his side. "Carter," she gasped, her voice thick with relief. She knelt down, wrapping her arms around him protectively. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into his hair. "I'm so sorry I left you alone." Carter clung to her, his small body trembling in her embrace. The tension in the bus eased slightly, though the confusion still lingered. What exactly had just happened? The driver stepped forward, his expression a mixture of concern and bewilderment. "Ma, is everything all right? Your boy, he wouldn't give up his seat. He said you told him not to move." Carter's mother pulled back slightly, brushing a hand through her disheveled hair as she struggled to find the right words. I told him to stay," because she hesitated, glancing around at the curious faces staring back at her. Then, with a deep breath, she continued, "Because someone's after us. I didn't want him to move in case they saw him." The bus seemed to freeze in time. "Someone's after you," the driver echoed, his eyes widening in disbelief. A murmur rippled through the passengers, uneasy whispers passing from seat to seat. Even the hum of the engine felt muted under the weight of this new revelation. Carter's mother, clearly distressed, glanced nervously around the bus, her gaze lingering on the windows, as if expecting to see someone lurking just outside. "Yes," she confirmed, her voice low and trembling. It's complicated, but we've been running for a while now." The driver, struggling to process what he was hearing, shifted on his feet. "Running from who? Is there someone after you right now?" Carter's mother nodded, pulling her son closer as though her embrace could shield him from whatever danger they faced. "There's a man. He's been following us for weeks. I don't know how he finds us, but he does. Every time we think we're safe, he shows up again." A cold shiver crawled up the driver's spine. Should we call the police?" "No," Carter's mother replied sharply, her voice filled with fear. "No police. He has connections, powerful ones. If we involve them, it could make things worse." The driver exchanged uneasy glances with Eric and a few other passengers. The tension in the air was thick, and the once peaceful bus ride had turned into something far more unsettling. "Then what do you want us to do?" the driver asked, his voice gentler now. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the kind of fear that goes beyond mere paranoia. This was something real, something dangerous. Carter's mother bit her lip, her eyes darting to the door as if she expected the man to walk in at any moment. "I just need to get him somewhere safe," she whispered, her gaze falling on Carter, who was clinging to her side. "We can't keep running like this. He needs to stop." The passengers were listening intently now, their curiosity tempered by the growing sense of dread that hung in the air. The idea that some unknown figure could be stalking a mother and her son, chasing them from place to place, was terrifying. And if it was true, what did that mean for the rest of them? Eric, who had been quiet for most of the exchange, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should all get off the bus," he suggested, his tone calm despite the gravity of the situation. "If this man is following them, it might be safer for everyone if we get to a more public area." The driver nodded slowly, considering the idea. "That might be a good idea," he said. "We're close to a station. We can call for help there, figure out what to do next." But before anyone could act, a loud bang echoed through the bus. The sound reverberated off the walls, sending a jolt of panic through everyone. Carter's mother flinched, her grip on him tightening as her eyes widened in fear. The passengers erupted into panicked whispers, turning in their seats to see where the noise had come from. Some peered through the windows, trying to catch a glimpse of the source. Outside, the world looked ordinary, almost eerily so, just a quiet street with parked cars and empty sidewalks. The driver spun around, his heart racing. What the hell was that? "It's him," Carter's mother whispered, her face drained of color. "He's found us." Suddenly, the bus doors hissed open, and everyone's attention snapped to the entrance. A man stood there tall, wearing a long coat that seemed to drape him in shadows. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a dark hat, casting a sinister silhouette. His presence alone sent a chill through the bus, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. He stepped inside, his movements slow and deliberate, each footstep echoing against the bus floor. The passengers froze, their fear palpable. No one dared to speak. Carter's mother gasped, instinctively pulling her son behind her as the man's gaze fell upon them. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The cold intensity in his eyes said everything. The driver, standing at the front, was the first to find his voice. "Sir, you need to leave," he said, though the quiver in his voice betrayed his own fear. The man ignored him. His eyes never left Carter and his mother, as if nothing else on the bus existed. Without warning, Carter's mother stood, pushing her son further behind her as she faced the man. "Stay away from us," she demanded, her voice shaking but fierce. "I won't let you take him." The man's lips curved into a thin, cruel smile. "You don't have a choice." The tension snapped like a rubber band stretched too far. Several passengers stood, ready to bolt for the exits, but the man held up a hand. "No one leaves," he said, his voice low and commanding, freezing everyone in their tracks. "Not until I have what I came for." The bus fell deathly silent. Fear hung in the air like a thick fog, and Carter's mother's breathing grew ragged, her mind racing for a way out. Carter, peeking out from behind her, could feel the weight of the moment. His small body trembled, but he remembered his mother's words. He couldn't move. Not yet. Not until it was safe. "Please," Carter's mother begged, her voice breaking. "Leave us alone." The man tilted his head, his expression almost amused by her desperation. "You know that's not going to happen. He belongs to me." The words sent a shock wave through Carter's mother. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, you can't have him." The man took a step forward, his hand outstretched as if reaching for something or someone. The air seemed to thicken, growing colder with each step he took. But then something changed. Carter's mother straightened, her fear replaced by something stronger. She turned to Carter, her eyes locking onto his with fierce determination. "Run," she whispered. Carter's heart leapt into his throat. "But Mom..." "Run," she repeated, her voice sharp and urgent. "Go. Now." Without thinking, Carter bolted from his seat, darting down the aisle as fast as his legs could carry him. The man lunged after him, but Carter's mother stepped in the way, blocking his path. The bus erupted into chaos as passengers scrambled to get out of the way, unsure whether to flee or stay. Carter didn't look back. He pushed through the crowd, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he reached the rear exit. He could hear his mother shouting, the man's cold voice rising above the commotion, but he didn't stop. He burst through the rear doors and into the street, his feet pounding against the pavement as he ran. The cold night air stung his lungs, but he didn't slow down. He didn't dare. Somewhere behind him, the bus doors slammed shut, and the world grew quiet again. But Carter kept running, his mother's words echoing in his ears. Carter's legs burned as he sprinted down the street, his mind racing faster than his feet. The world outside felt vast and indifferent, the cold air biting at his skin as he ran through the darkened streets. But he couldn't stop, not now. His mother's voice still echoed in his ears, urging him to run, to escape. He darted between alleys, his heart pounding in his chest, each breath coming in ragged gasps. But even as the distance between him and the bus grew, fear gnawed at his mind. What about his mother? What had happened back there? The thought of leaving her behind filled him with guilt, but he knew she wanted him safe. He had to keep going. The sound of footsteps behind him jolted him back into the present. Someone was following him. He risked a glance over his shoulder and felt his stomach drop. It was the man. He was relentless, moving with a speed that seemed unnatural. His long coat billowed behind him as he closed the distance between them, his face still shrouded in shadow, but Carter could feel his eyes, cold and predatory, locked onto him. Carter's heart raced even faster. He couldn't outrun this man. He had to think, had to find somewhere to hide. His eyes darted around, searching for anything an open door, a place to slip into the shadows. His feet skidded around a corner, and he spotted a narrow alley ahead, hidden between two buildings. Without hesitation, he dove into the alley, pressing himself against the wall, trying to make himself as small as possible. His breaths were shallow, barely more than whispers as he listened, hoping, praying that the man hadn't seen him. The footsteps slowed, their echo growing louder, more deliberate. The man was close, too close. Carter squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to disappear, to blend into the darkness. His small frame trembled, and he fought to control his breathing as the sound of the man's footsteps drew nearer, pausing just outside the alley. For a long moment, there was silence. Carter dared not breathe, every second feeling like an eternity. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out all other sounds. And then, just as suddenly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. The man had moved on. Carter exhaled slowly, relief flooding him. But he knew it wasn't over. He couldn't stay hidden forever. He had to get help. Emerging cautiously from the alley, Carter glanced around. The street was empty now, but the danger still lingered in the air, a shadow that refused to lift. He needed to find somewhere safe, somewhere the man couldn't reach him. In the distance, a faint light caught his eye. A small diner, its neon sign flickering, stood at the end of the block. Without a second thought, Carter bolted toward it, hoping the man wouldn't see him. The bell above the door jingled as he burst inside, startling the few late-night patrons. A woman behind the counter looked up, startled. "Hey kid, you okay?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as she took in his disheveled appearance. Carter, out of breath and terrified, shook his head. "Please, you have to help me. He's coming. He's after me." The woman's expression softened as she came around the counter, kneeling to his level. "Who's after you, sweetie? What's going on?" Carter opened his mouth to explain, but before he could get the words out, the door to the diner swung open. The man stood there, silhouetted against the neon glow. His presence seemed to suck the air out of the room, and everyone inside fell silent, the casual chatter dying in their throats. Carter felt a wave of panic rise in him, but the woman grabbed his hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "Stay behind me," she whispered, standing between him and the man. The man took a step forward, his cold gaze fixed on Carter. "The boy comes with me," he said, his voice like ice. "Now." The woman didn't flinch. "Over my dead body," she snapped, her voice steady and defiant. The man's eyes narrowed, but he didn't move. For a moment it seemed like a standoff. The patrons, frozen in fear, looked between the two, unsure of what would happen next. Then, without warning, the man turned and left, the door swinging shut behind him. Carter's heart was pounding so hard he could barely hear over the sound of it. The woman turned to him, her face serious but kind. "You're safe now," she said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his face. "We'll get you the help you need." Carter nodded, but his thoughts were already miles away back with his mother. He had to go back for her. He couldn't leave her behind with that man. "Thank you," he whispered to the woman, his voice small but determined. "But I need to go back. My mom. She's still out there." The woman looked at him, understanding in her eyes. "We'll call for help, okay? We'll get someone to find her." But Carter knew deep down that this was something more, something far from what any police could fix. That man, he wasn't just following them. He wanted something. As the diner bustled back to life around him, Carter stared out the window, his mind racing. The night felt colder now, the street outside eerily quiet. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain: this wasn't over. It was only the beginning.